Hi, everyone. Welcome to Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I've spent over 25 years inside hospital operations, and I'm here to share what I've learned about how to actually sell into this environment and what's changing right now. So today I want to talk about something that I think is probably the most important shift happening in healthcare sales right now. And it's this idea that your hospital buyers are making their decisions before they ever talk to you. And I know that sounds dramatic, but the data on this is really, really striking. So Dreamdata, they reran their B2B buyer journey research this year, and they've basically reset every benchmark that commercial teams have been working against. And what they found is that 81% of the buying cycle now happens before a buyer ever talks to a salesperson, right? That's up from 70% last year. And I think the complexity inside that pre-sale window is accelerating just as fast. So let me give you the numbers because I think, they really tell the story. You're looking at 88 touch points now in the average buying cycle. That's up from 76. 4 channels involved, up from about 3.7, and 10 stakeholders shaping the decision, up from almost 7. And here's the one that I think should really make you pause. 272 days from first impression to close deal. That's 9 months of you not being in the room. And, for anyone selling into hospitals, those figures should really change how you think about pipeline, because the hospital decision cycle was already the most layered, environment in B2B, right? And it's now gotten denser, it's gotten longer, and it's almost entirely self-directed in those early phases. So by the time your CFO or your VP of supply chain takes the call, the decision is, largely formed. They've read your competitors' case studies. They've asked to peer in their Chime or HFMA network. They've watched a webinar from someone in your category. They've scrolled through your LinkedIn posts, and they've almost certainly run a few prompts through ChatGPT or Claude to, stress test their thinking. And so the conversation you thought was the start of the deal is, it's really closer to the middle, and often it's the end. So what do 88 touch points actually look like inside hospital? And I think, the Dreamdata benchmark is actually conservative for healthcare. So a typical health system evaluation now moves through, a clinical champion, an executive sponsor, supply chain, finance, IT, compliance, legal, a value analysis committee, infection prevention review for anything touching the patient, and increasingly, a chief AI or transformation officer. 10 stakeholders barely covers it for any meaningful capital purchase or service line decision. And here's the thing, right? Those stakeholders, they're not coordinating. They're gathering information independently, mostly through content, and they're arriving at the table with, their own conclusions already formed. So your job between that first signal of interest and the first call is to make sure the version of you that lives in their heads is the version you would actually want representing the deal. And I think most sellers have no idea what that version looks like because they've never audited it. So let me talk about what hospital leaders are actually carrying right now, because I think this is really important context. And every C-suite conversation I've had this year keeps returning to the same set of pressures, and they're all converging at once. So first, margins, right? 72% of hospital CFOs are reporting operating margins of 2% or less. And, Coffin Hall's January data shows that the new year began with depressed margins, lower volumes, higher labor spend, and rising bad debt. That's a really, really difficult starting point. Then you've got the CMS team model that went live January 1st, 2026. It's 5 years. It's mandatory bundled payments across 5 surgical episodes for selected hospitals. And, most participants are just not operationally ready. The HCA HPS overhaul is reshaping how patient experience translates into reimbursement under VBP. You've got workforce shortages that, no signing bonus is solving. Cybersecurity exposure that the Change Healthcare attack made impossible to ignore. AI adoption pressure with no clear ROI playbook. And then site of service economics moving volume out of inpatient and into ambulatory. And each one of those is a board level conversation, right? Most CFOs and COOs are juggling all 7 at the same time while running the day to day. And they have less time to take vendor calls than they did 3 years ago. And, far more sources of information competing for the time they do have. And so this is the environment in which, build a content engine kind of became the dominant marketing prescription across healthcare technology and devices and services. And it's also the environment in which most of those engines are quietly failing. So let me talk about why the content engine model keeps failing, because I think this is where so many teams are getting it wrong. The current thinking is, buyers self-educate, so produce more for them to consume, right? Add posts, add webinars, add white papers, add podcasts, hire an agency, spin up a content factory. And the factory optimizes for output, not impact, right? Cadence, quantity, pieces shipped per quarter, touches per account, all of it gets reported on dashboards. And, none of it consistently shows up in pipeline. And what hospital buyers actually want is the opposite of volume. They want, deep, nuanced insights. They want new, innovative ways to help solve their challenges. They want a vendor who understands bundled payment structure better than their internal finance team does. They want frameworks they can take into their next executive meeting. They want, a peer-level take on what hospitals 3 states over are doing about workforce or HCA, HPS, or surgical bundles. And I think the most expensive content mistake healthcare commercial teams are making right now, and I see this all the time, is producing more material that no hospital leader actually needs. So what does high-value content actually look like to a hospital buyer? And I think, the best way to think about it is the way a product team thinks about a software release. Every feature is built for user impact, right? Every release teaches the team something that gets folded back into the next one, and the product gets smarter over time. And I think content for hospital buyers should work the exact same way. Like, each piece should earn its place in a CFO's week, right? It should tell them something they didn't already know, or give them a structure they can use, or sharpen them for their next executive conversation. And I think there are 3 qualities that separate content that compounds from content that just disappears. The first one is it speaks at peer level. Hospital C-suites don't need vendors explaining HRP or VBP to them, right? They need vendors who can engage with the second and third order implications of policy changes that most analysts haven't even surfaced yet. And I think, if your content could have been written by a marketing intern with a search engine, that's how it's going to be read. The second is it carries a point of view. And, the most shared content among hospital leaders right now is sharp, opinionated work from people who are willing to take positions on team readiness, HCA, HPS strategy, where capital should and shouldn't be deployed. Generic best practice content just disappears the moment it lands. And the third one is it builds infrastructure rather than just filling a calendar, right? Each piece should leave something structural behind. So now I want to get into something that I think almost no commercial team is paying attention to right now. And it's this question of, what are your buyers asking AI about you? Because there's a layer of that 81% that almost nobody is measuring, and it's the layer where the most consequential conversations are happening. Your buyers aren't just reading content anymore, right? They're asking ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, Gemini, Google AI overviews to do the work for them. And, the data on this is no longer speculative. 32% of B2B buyers now use generative AI tools as much as traditional search when researching vendors. 47% are using AI for market research and discovery, 38% for shortlisting vendors, and 33% to engage with vendors directly. And 45% of B2B buyers said they used AI during a recent purchase, and 67%, now prefer a rep-free buying experience. And Gartner is projecting that by 2028, 90% of B2B buying tasks will be AI handled, not AI assisted, right? AI handled. And I think the behavioral shift underneath those numbers is even more striking. So the average Google user runs about 4 searches a day, right? But the average AI user submits something like 34 prompts a day. So your buyers aren't asking the AI one question about your category. They're asking it 20, in conversation with follow-ups and refinements and cross-checks. And by the time they finish a session, they've got something close to like a private analyst report. And your name is either in it or it's not. And in healthcare, the prompts have already evolved way past best vendors for X. Hospital CFOs, supply chain leaders, value analysis chairs, chief AI officers. They're asking questions that tie directly to the regulatory and financial pressures they're actually managing. Things like, which medical device companies help hospitals reduce costs under team bundled payments? Who actually understands the HCA-PS digital transition and can help protect VBP revenue? Which RPM platforms are being used by team-mandated hospitals for the 30-day post-discharge window? What companies should a system CFO talk to about workforce technology that doesn't require a 5-year payback. And if you don't know whether your name comes up in those answers, you don't know what's happening in the most important 60 seconds of your buying cycle. And I think almost no one in healthcare commercial is auditing this yet. So I think the instinct most marketing teams have is to treat AI search like another SEO channel, right? And it's not. The mechanics are different in ways that really change the playbook. So in Google, you compete for clicks against 10 blue links, right? But in ChatGPT, there are no 10 blue links. There's one synthesized answer with, a small handful of cited sources. Perplexity averages about 7.5 cited domains per answer. ChatGPT averages about 4. And if you're not in those 4 to 7 slots, you're not in the consideration set. There is no page 2. And citations behave differently across engines, right? Perplexity shows numbered, ranked sources inline on every answer. ChatGPT cites sparingly and sometimes not at all. Claude hedges its recommendations and names brands more cautiously. Google AI overviews collapse their citations behind a link count. And each engine selects sources from a different mix of signals, which means, a brand can be visible in one and completely invisible in another. So cross-engine averages kind of hide what's actually happening. And I think one of the things people miss is that recognition and source authority are two different battles, right? A buyer can hear your name mentioned in a ChatGPT answer without your domain being cited as the source. The reverse is also true, and winning one doesn't solve the other. Most teams aren't even tracking the difference. And the signals that drive citations are not the signals that drive Google rankings, right? AI engines reward content that's, structurally chunkable, FAQ-shaped, comparison-shaped, schema-marked, and that lives on domains the model already trusts as authoritative in your category. So a blog post that's designed to rank for a keyword is often, the wrong shape to be cited in an answer. And here's one that I think is really sneaky. Personalization quietly distorts what teams see. When your marketing team prompts ChatGPT from their work account to check whether your brand shows up, they're seeing a personalized answer shaped by their own search history. The buyer asking the same question from a hospital network is seeing something totally different. So if you're auditing without a clean room, you're auditing a flattering mirror. So this is the part that I think, most teams skip. They jump straight to optimization before they've even done the diagnostic work. And I think the right sequence is, reverse first, then audit, then build. So the first step is to reverse engineer the prompt set. And what I mean by that is, sit down with your sales leaders, your sharpest reps, and maybe 1 or 2 friendly customers if you've got them, and build a list of like 50 to 100 prompts that a real hospital buyer would actually type, not the prompts your marketing team wishes they would type, right? And group them by buyer role. So your CFO, COO, VP supply chain, value analysis chair, chief AI officer, clinical champion, group them by buying stage, like problem aware, solution aware, vendor aware, decision stage, and then group them by the pressure that triggered the search, whether that's team readiness, HCHPS exposure, workforce, cybersecurity, capital allocation. That's your audit instrument. Get this right and everything else follows. And then you run those prompts across all 4 engines in clean conditions, right? So ChatGPT in a temporary chat with memory off, Perplexity in a private window, Claude in a fresh conversation, Gemini and Google AI overviews from a logged out browser. Run each prompt the same way every time, log the answer, log the sources cited, log whether your brand was named, log which competitors were named. And I know, this is tedious, but I think it's probably the highest leverage research a healthcare commercial team can do this year. And then you score every answer on 3 layers. First, brand recognition, right, where you named it all. Second, source authority, was your domain cited as the source the answer leaned on. And third, narrative accuracy. And this is the one that people miss when you were named, was the thing it said about you, the thing you actually want hospital buyers to believe. Because, a surprising amount of the time, the AI is naming brands but mischaracterizing them. And that's a fixable problem, but only if you know what's happening. And then you map competitive citations, the domains that show up next to yours and the domains that show up instead of yours. They're telling you what the model treats as authoritative in your category. And almost always it's a mix you would not have predicted, right? Like a regulatory primary source, an analyst piece you forgot existed, a peer-reviewed study, one specific competitor's resource page, and sometimes even a Reddit thread or a niche newsletter. That mix is the actual editorial board for your category right now, and your job is to be on it. And I think the most useful output of this audit isn't a score, right? It's a list of prompts where you're invisible, prompts where you're mentioned but misdescribed, and prompts where a competitor owns the answer cleanly. Each of those is a content brief, a real one, with a defined buyer, a defined intent, and a measurable target. And then you got to rerun the audit on a cycle. AI engines update their indexes constantly, citation positions move, competitors publish, and models change behavior. A one-time audit is just a snapshot of a moving target, right? The teams that win this are running it quarterly at minimum, and the most aggressive ones are running monthly. So what does all of this mean for healthcare commercial teams right now? So the hospital buyer who's asking ChatGPT which RPM platforms are team ready in May 2026, that person is making a decision that's going to be largely formed before any vendor knows the question was even asked, right? And that's the new front of the buying cycle. And it's also where the biggest gap exists between the teams who are paying attention and the teams who are not. And I think most healthcare commercial teams are still operating as if the funnel begins at the form fill. It doesn't. It begins at the prompt. And the teams that build a disciplined audit cadence on what their buyers are asking AI engines and a content infrastructure designed to be cited rather than just ranked, they're going to own a structural advantage in this market for the next several years. And I think the window on that advantage is open right now and closing fast. So I want to give you 3 things you can actually do this week, like between now and Friday. And I think these are really, really practical. So number 1, run what I call the stakeholder mirror test on your last 3 close-loss deals. And what you do is you pull the last 3 deals you lost in the final stages, right? For each one, list every stakeholder you know was involved, and then list every piece of your content, every LinkedIn post, every email, every webinar that stakeholder plausibly saw before the decision. And if the answer for any stakeholder is nothing, that's your gap. And if the answer is like 2 LinkedIn posts about our product features, I'd say that's actually a worse gap, right? The goal is an attribution. The goal is to see, honestly, what version of you was in the room when you weren't. Number 2, and I think this is so, so important, write one piece this week that no one else in your category could have written. Not a product post, not a 5 tips post. One piece, 800 words is plenty, that takes a defensible position on something a hospital CFO is wrestling with right now, like team target price methodology or the HCHPS digital transition, the cybersecurity insurance cliff, site of service economics in your specialty. And I think the test is this, right? If a competitor's marketing team could have written it, don't publish it. But if a CFO could forward it to their CEO without embarrassment, you're close. And number 3, build one reusable piece of infrastructure, not another deliverable, right? Pick one frame, one model, or one diagnostic that your buyers can use without you in the room, like a 4-question team readiness self-assessment or a 1-page worksheet that maps a service line's HCA-HPS exposure under the new methodology, or a capital allocation lens for AI investments tied to specific reimbursement levers. Build it once, put your name on it, and let it travel. Because I think, the piece of paper that ends up on a CFO's desk 3 months from now is worth so much more than 30 posts that get a polite like. So before I wrap up, I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm opening up to a small group of healthcare commercial teams this quarter. So the first is what I'm calling the hospital buyer content audit. And what I'll do is personally review up to 90 days of your outbound content, your LinkedIn email sequences, white papers, webinars, sales decks. And I'll tell you line by line what a hospital CFO, COO, VP of supply chain, and value analysis chair would actually do with each piece. Like, would they read it? Would they forward it? Or would they just roll their eyes, maybe delete it? You'll get a marked up file, a 1-page summary of what's working, what's invisible, and what's actively hurting you, and 3 specific pieces of infrastructure I would build first if I were running your commercial team. And, this isn't a content audit from a marketing agency, right? This is a buyer side audit from someone who sat across the table from your buyers for over 25 years. The second offering is the hospital buyer AI search audit. And for most teams, I think this is the more urgent one right now. So what I'll do is build a prompt set that's, really specific to healthcare and tailored to your category and the roles you're selling to. So your CFO, COO, VP supply chain, value analysis chair, and clinical champion. And then I run all of those across ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, Gemini, Google AI overviews, all under clean conditions. And you'll get a written report covering, where your brand is named and where it's invisible, where your domain is cited as a source, and where competitors own the citation slots, where the AI is misdescribing what you do, which prompts are owned cleanly by a single competitor and why, and then a prioritized list of the specific content pieces and structural fixes I'd build first to start moving the needle. And this is the diagnostic that almost no one in healthcare commercial has run yet. And I think, the teams that run it first are the ones who are going to own the next several years of pre-sale visibility. Both audits can be run separately or stacked. And stacked is the version I'd push you toward because, the AI search audit tells you what your buyers are actually asking, and the content audit tells you whether what you're publishing actually answers it. If you're interested in either one, there's a link in the show notes to reach me directly on LinkedIn, or you can email me at lisa@lisatmiller.com. I'm taking a limited number this quarter. So I think the question worth sitting with this week, if you sell into hospitals, is really whether the content you're producing would meaningfully sharpen the thinking of the executive you're trying to reach. Not whether it's on brand, not whether it's shipped on schedule, but whether it would actually move them. And I think most of what gets produced fails that test, right? The commercial teams that pass it are the ones building the next decade of pipeline. And I also wrote a longer companion piece earlier this year on how medical device and life sciences and healthcare technology companies can use AI search to win hospital contracts in 2026. And, you can find that in the show notes as well. All right, that's it for today's episode of Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller, and I'll be back next week with more strategies to help you sell smarter and stand out.